vistas of the West disclose the pattern of a land of great space. It's a region of infinite variety and striking contrasts. For in the Pacific Coast states of Washington, Oregon, and California, and in Idaho and Nevada, which adjoin them, we can find perhaps a greater range of topography, of climate, of rainfall, and of crops than anywhere else in the world. This was a land of promise to the pioneers, and it's a land of accomplishment in the present day. Here, not far apart, we find the highest mountains and the arid and wind-blown deserts of sand or of sagebrush. Here are the last great forests of big timber, trees which were age-old when our maps first extended beyond the Mississippi. Fine stands of fir and hemlock, cedar, spruce, redwood, and pine. Clean, clear water gushing from these hillsides, a haven for wildlife and a retreat for the man who seeks the pleasures of the great outdoors. In part of this region of extreme contrasts, as much as 200 inches of rain a year causes the land to be lush with vegetation, while elsewhere only a few inches of rain makes water supply a critical problem, and irrigation is required. The picture changes rapidly in the West, where every acre is not like every other acre. There are hillsides and valleys covered with fruit trees, and pastures where fine dairy herds graze. Lights and shadows of sun and clouds disclose rolling slopes covered with grains and grasses. There are ranges abounding with livestock, stakes on the hoof, cows and cowboys heading for the old corral. Only a few decades ago in Western history, the native grasses covered vast areas of hills and valleys, and the hills were uncut by gullies. Before we had to plow for bread and graze cattle for meat, the natural cover held the soil. Before we had to clear the land for farms and hew trees for buildings, more of the land was in virgin timber. The rotting litter in deep woodland glades and the natural forest carpet of fern and moss held the moisture, and water seeped into the ground or trickled gradually down to the lowlands. In the West, for the most part, the good topsoil still remains. It is in these few inches near the surface that nature's soil factory is at work. It is only in this narrow layer, which varies in thickness, that rotting plant life puts back into the soil that nourishing richness which growing plants take out. And the good topsoil is not without limit. But we seeded the hills to grain and fallowed the land, and the bare earth after harvest was exposed to the mercy of running water and gusty winds. We burned the stubble off the fields and destroyed the grain straw which would have held the soil. On the ranges, overgrazing by cattle and sheep used up the rich grasses, and millions of acres were taken over by sagebrush and weeds, by cactus and cheatgrass. There are other indications of what can happen to the good soil. Here we failed to provide for disposal of wastewater, and a gully 80 feet deep was formed in only a few years. Forest fires have exposed vast areas of our best timberland to washing. Many of these losses are the result of man's own carelessness. Wind, too, has taken its toll in dry land orchards and vineyards. There is nothing in this soil to bind it together. The wind moves the sand from place to place, and bared and dying roots are the result of lack of protective cover. We are losing the good topsoil from orchards where trees have been planted up and down hillsides. We are losing the good topsoil from the sloping grain fields. We may not notice a little silt washing down into the roadway, but every rain is taking it down relentlessly because there is nothing to stop it. Every drill mark running up and down hill provides a natural path for a soil-bearing rivulet each time it rains. Even in some areas where the topsoil is unusually deep, there is evidence of the gradual shift of soil downhill. Down the slope from the top of the hill, the rich topsoil is still quite deep. But as you go up the hill, the band of good productive earth above the subsoil narrows down to only half the depth. Sheet erosion like this is caused by every rain. Bald spots showing through on hilltops which were once dark with rich topsoil are clear indications of the constant loss. The good topsoil of Washington, of Oregon, the crop-growing surfaces of California, of Nevada, and of Idaho, washing down to form muddy banks below, and to silt up dams and reservoirs and highway ditches. The good earth of the West, hurrying down to the sea. Water rushing down to the ocean cuts gullies on its way, and gullies are the last stage of this cancer on the land. Gullied land is difficult land to farm, and very often it becomes impossible to farm. We can't move on to greener pastures as did our forefathers. We are spending the land, and nature alone can't build it back in a century of time. Awake to the possibility of what can happen, we're taking steps to stop such losses. We're beginning to farm so as to make the best use of each acre according to its needs and adaptability. Farmers and federal and state agencies realize the need of a definite program of saving the soil. So we find groups of farmers joining together voluntarily in local soil conservation districts to work out programs which will obtain maximum permanent production. It's a neighborly, a truly American way of getting something done which needs badly to be done. Through these districts, farmers obtain the technical assistance of the Soil Conservation Service, the educational assistance of the state colleges, and help from other agencies. There are many ways in which conservation men work with farmers to solve individual problems. The total soil resources of the farm are inventoried on maps, and practical programs worked out for the best use of each part of the acreage. Engineers assist by devising means to control and dispose of water, or to spread water to more acreage. Some land requires a permanent drainage system as a first step in increasing its productivity. Some good bottom land needs an open ditch or tiling. Other conservation men bring knowledge of tested and proven practices which contribute to better land use. There is something in the program which applies to every farmer and rancher, whether he is grazing cattle on a vast area of rangeland or farming a half-acre plot of vegetables or flowers. To bloom and bear, all crops need the vital element, water. And so in the West, winter snows on the high mountains furnish the key to a supply of water for agriculture. For in this region of 5 western states lie half of all the irrigated lands of our nation. The supply, which will run down from the mountains each year, is estimated from the federal state snow surveys. Thus, where irrigation is necessary, the amount available is estimated in advance. Irrigation districts and farmers can plan how best to use it. When the water from the irrigation canals reaches the farmer's land, it is then up to him to make the most efficient use of his allotted share. Leveling uneven land is one step toward better irrigation, for it permits even distribution of the water. Wherever it's practical to level the land, it will result in less labor, more even penetration of water into the soil, and more uniform crops. And whether the farmer employs ditches and furrows, or portable pipes or sprinkler systems, flat land will contribute to the ease of farming. How much water to use is then the farmer's problem. The Soil Conservation Service aids him by studying the entire acreage and determining the time and rate of application which will give maximum benefit without waste to each part of the field. These studies have been brought down to a fine science, and the good irrigator takes advantage of such tests and then keeps a close check on how the water is penetrating his soil. He avoids waterlogged fields and loss of soil through excessive runoff by limiting his use of water to the times when the soil becomes dry enough to absorb it evenly to the proper depth. Where the land is sloping, the good irrigator always plants and irrigates across the slope to stop his soil from washing. He controls every outlet from the head ditches or flumes. Water runs downhill of its own accord, and moving water carries soil. Trickling water seeps in, so the good irrigator makes his pattern of furrows so that the water has short runs along gentle grades. Even where grades are extremely slight, it pays to follow contour lines when furrowing for irrigation. Permanent grade lines are easily maintained in orchards by various methods of marking trees. Thus, the annual furrows can be set up by simply following the route which is indicated by the markings on the trees. Another good conservation practice in fruit culture is the use of cover crops to enrich the soil and to prevent the ground from washing during winter rains. Many types of cover crops, varying with local soil and water conditions, are used. But legumes are favorites in many sections because they're good soil building agents. On their roots are small nodules of bacteria which gather nitrogen from the air and put it into the ground. When the cover crop is disked in the spring, the operation leaves most of the vegetation at the surface and roughens and loosens the soil. The decaying plants and their roots form a rich humus. Thus, a natural soil and chemical factory is set up close to the surface. In this factory, nature makes plant foods available to feed the tree roots. In many vineyards which were clean tilled, the good humus was exhausted, the soil structure broken down, and the surface subjected to blowing. But under a new policy, vetch or other valuable cover crops are planted each year after the old vines are trimmed, holding the sandy soil in place and providing a good new surface mulch. The value of decaying vegetation is especially well illustrated in the woods, where the ground litter decomposes and forms a good protective cover. Copious rainfall and rich forest soil make the Pacific timberland one of the world's fastest growing tree farms. Out of the duff and through the fern, little seedlings spring up by the million. Fine stands of timber provide many farmers with trees which can be cropped like any other product of the soil. The farmer who manages his farm forest to produce a good crop from time to time marks the trees to be cut on a selective basis. He harvests the trees when they're mature, to be hauled out to the mills for use as lumber or pulp or plywood. This is sound economy, for trees mature and die, as evidenced by many old forest giants which could have been harvested when they were ripe. He thins out trees that are weak, diseased, or misshapen, and markets the saleable products for poles, fence posts, ties, or firewood. He leaves the remaining trees well spaced to get the full benefit of sunlight and air and moisture. A well-managed grove will yield 3 times as much as the average untended woods. Having a farm woodlot on a hill is good land use. It anchors the soil and provides a cash crop in the bargain. Trees planted on a hilltop serve other useful purposes. In some areas, they keep snow from drifting onto the north slopes and prevent the type of soil slips which have ruined many such hillsides. Protected, such land can be put to good use for hay or pasture. Many methods of holding the topsoil in place are helpful. Natural drainage ways carry excess storm water from the fields. Many such waterways provide a hay crop, and they are shaped so that farm equipment can easily be worked across them. Terraces across a sloping field serve as dams to halt the downward rush of storm water and conduct it slowly to the outlets. Of special importance in the grain country are practices which will not only protect the land during the rainy season, but also help maintain the fertility of the soil. For example, a conservation farmer spreads the straw from the combine. He doesn't burn it up, but he scatters it over the field. As one farmer expresses it, leave everything on the land that you don't have to take off to eat or sell. A good field of stubble is now regarded as an asset and not a nuisance. After harvest, the stubble fields are disked lightly or plowed with sweeps so that the straw is left close to the surface and also on top of the ground. This leaves the earth in a rough, cloddy condition as protection against soil blowing away. The stubble mulch turns into plant food quicker when it's close to the surface, and it acts as a binder to stabilize the soil. Stubble left on top of the field is not the mark of a careless farmer, but the trademark of a good, progressive operator. When it rains, the spongy mass of rotting stubble breaks the fall of each drop of water, soaking it up like a blotter. Little soil is washed down to the creeks from this kind of a field. Weeds can be kept down in stubble fields by a rod weeder or other tools such as wide sweeps. Such implements leave the valuable mulch near the top of the ground. In the bean and pea areas also, the use of vines as ground-holding mulch and fertilizer is being recognized. The vines are returned to the fields and disked in. And dry pea or bean stubble spread on the field from the combines will be turned into the surface. Several related practices contribute greatly toward the main objective of using the land according to its best capabilities. Farming on the contour, strip cropping, and rotation of grains, row crops, and grasses are all part of the conservation way of farming. Contour farming means simply doing all operations on the level, around the slopes, eliminating uphill pulls and resulting in less wear and strain on farm equipment. Square field farming fits in only on flat land, but very little land is perfectly flat. On the hillsides, alternate bands of crop and stubble fallow are laid out in strips running at right angles to the natural drainage. The yield is higher than if the entire area were in crop one year and fallow the next. Alternating strips of clean tilled row crops and thick-growing grass legumes hold the soil in place and retard the runoff. Good land use keeps the top of the hills in grass and lower slopes and valleys in rotations that include grasses and legumes. Proper land use often includes raising hay crops on hilltop and hillside land. Good cover of this kind will stop washing almost as well as a permanent forest. Grass legume crops on the hilltops help control the washing that would result on lower slopes if the field were farmed as one unit. The cut strip gives access to the grain fields and furnishes a permanent contour guideline for the rotated strips below. Sweet clover and other green fertilizer crops, when plowed into the topsoil, return a vitalizing humus to the land. Sweet clover, alfalfa, and other legumes add nitrogen and make a healthier soil. This is actual soil building to maintain the producing capacity of the land. The results of such practices have been proven time and again in the yields obtained in succeeding years. The development of soil building and erosion-resisting grasses is part of the program of the Soil Conservation Service. Hundreds of varieties of seeds are planted and their growth studied in different soils. Promising varieties are grown to increase the seed supply and distributed to soil conservation districts where such grasses are needed to halt erosion and rebuild soil. New combinations of grasses and legumes are developed and tried out in test pastures where the results are determined by the actual pounds of beef which the cattle put on in each. The development of good pastures for dairy herds and for beef cattle as well is an important part of the land use recommendations of the Soil Conservation Service. Proper land planning frequently discloses acreage which is better suited for pasture or hay than for annual crops. Where additional water other than rainfall is needed, sprinkler irrigation is coming more and more into favor in some sections. Cattle are rotated from one pasture to another. This is good conservation because it allows the grasses and legumes to make new growth. Pastures are clipped in their turn as a means of weed control, and thus the grasses and legumes get all the available moisture. Sheep, too, need good pastures, and when they're moved down from the summer ranges, there must be some place for them to feed. The time was when practically all of the sheep raising in the West was done on the open range the year round. Huge bands moved with the seasons, accompanied by herders and dogs and camp wagon. The bands are still on the move, but through irrigation and seedings, we are also developing more ranch pastures where sheep can be carried over winter in good condition. In the beef cattle country, the changes which range management have brought about are striking. They are a good and necessary start toward permanence in the livestock business. First, there must be more good grass on the ranges and the ranch pastures. Ranchers are beginning to meet this need by reseeding and by withholding certain tracts from grazing until the grass gets a firm stand which will last from year to year. The good forage plants must be strong enough to hold their own against sagebrush, weeds, and poorer grasses. They must be allowed to produce seed and remain high enough that grazing will not kill them out. The better range grasses, which have a good root structure, will do much toward replenishing the soil on depleted ranges and help prevent erosion. More fencing supplies part of the necessary measures needed to improve the range. Here's a property line fence. On the one side, poor, water-scarred land with only the scrubby growth remaining as a direct result of overgrazing. On the other side of the fence, native bunch grass is being grazed properly, so it stays in excellent condition. There are few bare spots, more water is retained, and a healthy growth of the bunch grass and the shorter grasses beneath is assured. Many ranches have been divided into unit pastures so that each may be grazed in turn and only at the right time. Range surveys by the Soil Conservation Service estimate the amount and condition of the grass on each part of the ranch and recommend the proper season and amount of grazing for each unit. An important factor is that the stock are not turned in too early in the spring. And they graze in one unit only so long so that the grass will be able to grow up again. To help ensure the range against overgrazing, the rancher provides a good quantity of supplemental forage to spread at the ranch feeding area. In many instances, irrigated fields will produce a large hay crop to round out the feed supply. It will carry livestock over between pasture seasons. It's an extra insurance against drought or unexpected lack of feed on the range itself. Supplemental feed also will help increase the rate of gain and improve the condition of the cattle. Another practice contributing to permanence of the ranges is the development and proper distribution of water. The Soil Conservation Service assists farmers and ranchers in the construction of stock ponds and the improvement of springs. Well-spaced water supply will prevent too much grazing at any one part of the range. Ponds should be fenced in to protect the banks from damage, and the water piped to an area below the dam where it's accessible only at troughs. Thus, the cattle can't trample the pond into a mud hole, and the water remains clean. Springs are covered with permanent protection, and water is piped away from the spring where the stock can easily reach it. A stock water pond on the farm is conservation in one of its most pleasant aspects. In summer, you can hang your clothes on a hickory limb, or swim if you want to, and skate in the winter. And with a can of worms and a willow pole, you can take 200 pounds of fish out of an acre pond in just one season. A conservation farm is a good place for people to live. And it's a good place for the wildlife which conservation farming practices encourage. These practices help to increase the numbers of the wildfowl on lakes and rivers and irrigation ditches. They also make it possible for more game birds to thrive in the fence rows and the hayfields. And they keep clear water running in the streams where a man can go fishing and relax after a job well done. Naturally, every farmer is interested primarily in yield and the assurance of next year's yield and the next and the next. There is no question that conservation farming, blended with other proven practices, increases the quantity and quality of agricultural products. Thousands of examples stand as proof that this common sense way of farming means better use of the land year in and year out. Such a program is needed to supply an ever-increasing population which is steadily moving westward. It is needed as an accompaniment to the development of water resources. Additional dams are furnishing added power to stimulate a growing industrial activity and to supply water to new lands which are suitable for agricultural use. The rapid growth of Western industries and the westward migration of people require more and more fertile land, and at the same time are a challenge and an incentive to the farmer to meet the need and profit by it. As this program is carried on from year to year, it fosters a stable agricultural community. It succeeds through the effort of farm neighborhoods and the action of farmers together in soil conservation districts. It contributes toward the development of better farms, better farm homes, and better living for the farmer who adds his share of the effort.